I can see that still a number of participants are dropping in. Yeah, now that it's 3 o'clock, I would like to open the fourth session of the annual meeting of the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles. And within this session, we want to take a look at the topic of identifying and addressing risks of informal employment. I would like to briefly introduce myself. My name is Christine Apfelstedt. I work in the Partnership Secretariat as a manager for living wages and purchasing practices, and I will be the moderator of today's webinar. I also would like to extend a warm welcome to the external guests that are joining us in this session. This session is an open session, and so we have members of the partnership joining in, but also external participants. Before entering into the content, I would like to highlight some technical details for this webinar. I assume that you're all by now familiar with it, but just in case, we have set all microphones to mute. And if you want to speak to one of the speakers today, please raise your hand so that we can make sure to unmute you, that you can raise your voice and directly address a question. You also have the possibility to send questions and comments to the moderator through the question window. In case you address it only to the moderator, this is basically an anonymous question. You can also choose to address it to all. And just for your information, this webinar will be recorded. Yeah, FYI. Now, moving into the objectives, why do we come here together in this session? I think what we would like to achieve with this session is that we would like to raise awareness for the risks that are related to informal employment. We would also like to introduce different ways that can be used to identify and address these risks. And we would also like to take the opportunity to discuss with you in the audience how the partnership can support members in dealing with these risks around informal employment in the future. And yeah, that brings me to introduce our truly international set of speakers that we have here today for this session. With me here today is Cape Town-based Marlese von Broembsen, who is a legal advisor at the network organization WIEGO, which stands for Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing. And also with me is member of the partnership, Dr. Sabine Ferenschild, who is a research associate at the Institute Suedwind. Then we have Dr. Lucy Brill, UK-based, of the NGO Home Workers Worldwide. And joining us from Washington, DC is Scott Welker from the NGO GoodWeave. And we also have Hamburg-based Maren Barthel with us from Elevate. And looking into the agenda, we have a quite packed schedule today, and we wanted to take the opportunity to invite different speakers to basically map the field a bit. So I would urge all of our speakers to be mindful of the time. We will also have a quick eye on the time just to make sure that we also have some time left in the end for question and discussion. I will briefly start off with an introduction to highlight why we wanted to have this session on informal work at this annual meeting, and then Marlese von Broembsen will give an input on how to define informal work, and she will take a look specifically on the risks that are associated with home workers. Then Sabine Ferenschild will provide some insights into research findings on migrant workers. And then we will have a look at 2 practical examples of how NGOs are working in practice dealing with home workers and providing remedy and mitigation here. And then we will also have a look at the topic of informal work, and from the perspective of an auditing company here, Maren Barthel will share some insights from the data that Elevate has generated from their audits. And then in the end, we have some time for questions and answers. Now, in this slide, I have brought here for you some headlines that really highlight that the topic of informal work has gained particularly importance in the context of the COVID crisis. Here you can see that the COVID crisis has put a particular strain on informal workers. And we also see that brands have been called upon to step up here and be mindful of those that are most vulnerable in the supply chain. And I think the second reason why we have this session on informal work today is that moving into 2021, our review process for companies has much more of a due diligence focus. So that means that companies will be asked to identify the key risks that are associated with their business operations in the supply chain for workers and also for the environment. And here I think particular care needs to be taken to identify who are the most vulnerable in my supply chain and what can I do to mitigate and prevent harms to them. And I think this kind of sets the scene for Marlese Broembsen, who is going to look into defining informal employment and also ways of identifying and addressing these. So Marlese, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for this invitation to address you. I woke up this morning feeling nervous about this presentation today, and I realized why, because it feels important. You know, for once, I'm addressing a group of people who can actually make a difference to the conditions for workers in supply chains. I want to ask you, well, I want to raise something I say to my students when I used to teach, which is we're going to be talking about definitions and data and policy today, but to remember behind that are real people, mostly women, who want the same things that you and I want. They want to earn enough to have a house that doesn't leak, to put food on the table, to make sure that their children are educated and have healthy bodies. And perhaps if I can make one more introductory comment, which is you heard that I work for WIEGO. We're a global advocacy research network, and we're a network made of organizations of informal workers, including home-based workers. So I represent WIEGO today, but I also represent home workers who we've identified work in global supply chains with brands in Europe from 11 countries in Asia and one in Southeast Asia, in Asia and one in Eastern Europe. And they are members of HomeNet South Asia and HomeNet Southeast Asia, who are also part of our network. Okay, so if I may begin, just to run through the slides for today, I'm going to be talking to you about defining informal work relative to non-standard work. We'll be looking at what does informal work look like in supply chains, both inside factories but also outside of factories. And then a special focus on home workers who are the most precarious workers in the supply chain. And then finally, particularly as you're thinking about mandatory due diligence, to some thoughts on worker-driven compliance. But thank you. Next slide. So the ILO defines informality as having no legal protection, but also as having no social protection. And very importantly, the ILO says it's if there's no protection de jure, in other words, in law, but also de facto, so in fact. This means that there could be workers who are legally protected and have rights as employees, but if the legislation is not enforced, de facto they're informal. So this slide defines informality from a labor law perspective. So standard employment has got 4 pillars to it. The first is that it's permanent, it's full-time, there's direct supervision on the employer's premises, and finally it's a bilateral relationship between employer and employees. So non-standard employment, which you're all familiar with, is a variation on any one of those pillars. So firstly, it could be temporary. In the context of garment supply chains, the temporary work with non-standard work has 2 primary forms. First is fixed term contract workers, workers who order or a year. And the second category of informal work is casual workers. So these are works brought on when the orders are bigger, and they are typically paid by the piece. So the second grouping of non-standard employment, if you look opposite full-time, is that they're part-time, if they're off premises, so in other words, it's subcontracted to either workshops or directly to home workers. And then finally, if they're engaged through intermediaries. So home workers could be a combination of those things. Be permanent, but they could also be part-time, off premises, and engaged through an intermediary. On the other hand, they could be full-time, but temporary and off premises, or also engaged through an intermediary. So that's what makes them a particularly precarious form of informal work. So next slide. So I know that the partnership is looking at the entire textile supply chain. And just to say that this presentation, and I think today, we're really speaking about one piece of the supply chain, which is the cutting, stitching, finishing function. So the next slide speaks to an actual supply chain in Tirupur in Tamil Nadu, India. So Tirupur is known as the t-shirt factory of the world. There are approximately 400 brands that have their knitwear made in Tirupur. So on the right-hand side is a picture of the actual supply chain. So at the top you have the global brand. You then have the first-tier suppliers, which have between approximately 1,500 workers. Your second tier, which has approximately 400 workers. Then workshops is the third tier, between 10 and 80 workers. And you'll see on the right-hand side, you have contractors, subcontractors, right down to homework. And then you have on the next tier, you have small workshops of between 1 and 10 workers, and then finally home workers at the bottom. Now, home workers in Tirupur can be contracted in a variety of ways. They can be contracted directly by the second tier supplier, sometimes the first tier. They can be contracted through workshops. They can be contracted through an intermediary, and sometimes even through other home workers. If you look on the left-hand side, this is from the National Labour Force Statistics for India, and it gives you a sense of the distribution of employment of these different tiers. So first and second tier together employ approximately 12.9 million workers. The workshops that have between 10 and 80 workers employ approximately 6.6 million workers. These tiny workshops of between 1 and 10 workers employ 16.3 million workers. And then home workers on estimated 5 million, and it's estimated because they're not counted in the labour force surveys. Although my source at the bottom is works at the National Statistics Office. So really what's important here is there's a law called the contract law in India, and it covers workshops that are 20 people or above. So we can see that the vast majority of people in India are outside of the factory, and the vast majority in the garment sector are informal. But this is not in India alone. And this slide here speaks to Indonesia. And you'll see from the pie chart on the right that almost 50% of workers are outsourced workers, so outside of the factory. And only 29.4% are permanent contracts. So again, we're looking at non-standard work in India, and the vast majority being informal. Well, not the majority, well, de facto certainly informal, but even legally. I see I made an error there saying trade unions think approximately 4.8% are outsourced. In fact, that's the labor force statistics. The trade unions put that at higher. They estimate approximately 60%. Next slide, please. This is a slide from the ILO in 2016, and it shows non-compliance with minimum wages. And you'll see that it's disaggregated according to gender, with the green column being women in garment supply chains. So you will see that there's a much greater non-compliance with minimum wages. Remember, not living wages, if in the case of women. And so if we think back to the definition of the ILO as informal work being de facto informal, you know, really a lot of the supply chain is de facto informal, particularly with respect to non-compliance with minimum wages. But the Better Factory Work project of the ILO has looked at non-compliance in other areas too. Next slide, please. So this is back to a labor law slide as a lens to think about how non-standard work is regulated. And many of you will be familiar with that in your own jurisdictions. So labor law has this binary division between two groups. On the one hand, employees, and on the other hand, independent contractors. Employees having an employment contract that triggers a whole range of employment rights, including collective bargaining and social protection, and independent contractors having no rights that are employee rights. And what many countries have done, including Asia, is to try and extend this category of employees to recognize forms of non-standard work. In some cases, we'd call them dependent contractors. So in most of the Asian countries, those non-standard work, or some of them, about half of them, the non-standard work categories have been recognized by law. But the problem is that the unintended consequences of that. So what it tends to do is to give legal and therefore social forms of work that actually are a kind of third class or second class employee. And they have legally fewer rights and entitlements to employees. In particular, if you think of fixed term contract workers, and they make up the bulk of the factory workers, fixed term contract workers have no rights to severance pay when they let go, and often they don't have rights to social protection, and in particular casual workers don't. But the third, apart from legal entitlements that are inferior to employees, they're real practical unintended consequences. So because dependent contractors or fixed term contract workers or casual workers are far more precarious in their work than permanent employees, they're much less likely to unionize, and they're a much more compliant workforce, therefore. We also know, and I've learned this during the time of COVID from our partners in the Asia Floor Wage Alliance, that what many of the suppliers do is, in order to avoid the legal regulations, so in some countries it would say you cannot, a person being a fixed term contract worker perpetuate. So once they've been, their contract to 2 years, automatically they become an employee. And so what the suppliers do is they send off their fixed term contract worker. Once they've reached 2 years, they send them home. And after 2 months at home, they come back and they start their 2-year period again. And so really the point here is, when you're thinking about mandatory due diligence or just workers in your supply chains, it becomes a bit of a nonsense to try and categorize work as informal or formal. I mean, really, these are all workers in the supply chain who should all be entitled to decent work. Next slide, please. So we at WIEGO believe that workers should speak for themselves. And so this is a video, they're very short videos of 2 home workers in Thailand who are going to speak for themselves. And I think Kristen said the writing might be a little bit small, in which case Kristen will read the writing to you. Is she not speaking? Huh, okay, I think I'm gonna have to have to say something. Okay, it's Kristen, shall I just speak, or do you think we may be able to fix that?
No, please, please, you go ahead.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
No worries. So yeah, I'm actually really sorry that you haven't heard. So the woman on the right, it's very moving because she speaks about how she works these incredibly long hours because she can't earn enough unless she works 10, 12 hours a day, and often works from 7 in the morning until 10 at night. That's longer than I work, right? And she talks about how sometimes she sits there and she needs to urinate, but she kind of thinks she just has to finish this bag. And she's had more than one. She's ended up having urinary tract infections. So it's a picture of the levels of exploitation driven by very, very low wages. Home workers tend to earn between a third and half of the minimum wage. So although they're not directly supervised and there's no one making them work those hours, in order to make the income they do. In other cases, we know that home workers say, the contractors will say, if you do not finish all this work within a particular period, we won't pay you for anything, even though they're paid by the piece. But on the right-hand side, the home worker there talks about why she works from home and what she was previously a factory worker, and that because she works from home, she's able to care for her children. And so I think we've got to be very careful not to have sort of facile positions around homework. So the home workers we work with would articulate that they want to work from home. They're not wanting to work in factories. And that would be for 4 reasons. So these are the 4 reasons why home workers should be supported and authorized in the context of garment supply chains. So firstly, the workers in factories are often very young. In some countries, the average age is till 25, others 30, sometimes 40. And so it is a question of access to labor markets for older women who have worked in this industry. Second, for many workers, it's a question of wanting to take on their own childcare. The hours in factories are often 12 hours, and that's not sort of child friendly. Thirdly, there are many women who live in villages just outside of cities, and because the intermediaries bring them the work and pick up the completed work, it means they're able to work. Whereas living in villages, they wouldn't be able to access that work without moving into the city. And then finally, for some women, there are both religious and cultural norms about not working outside of the home. And homework is the only way that they are able to, to access work and to have their own money. So thank you. Next slide. So as you all know, the OECD guidance for garment and footwear sector has a module in it, module 12, which specifically talks about homework. And so to outline 3 quick points about the module. So the first is that home workers are legitimate workers in the supply chain. Second is that the understanding of formalization is not that home workers need to do something to formalize, like register. Formalization means having written contracts. And the point I would like to make today is that it's very important for these written contracts to have the name of the brand in them. Most of the time, home workers don't know who they're producing for. And the name of the brand is important for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it enables the home worker to be able to go to the website of the brand and see if there's a human rights policy, which in terms of the UN guiding principles, certainly the partnership members I think are aiming for. And then secondly, it's a way for home workers to let brands know that we're organized and we have an organization that you can engage with. The guidance talks about meaningful engagement with vulnerable groups. And this meaningful engagement is important for two reasons. The first is that it enables home workers to engage with brands on what are the kinds of complaints mechanisms that you can establish that don't risk home workers losing their jobs, because that's the thing they're also frightened of. And then secondly, to engage with them on remedies in the case of human rights violations. So you'll see on the right is a picture of, it's a brochure, a sort of booklet that we've put together for home worker organizations on the OECD guidance. Okay, thank you. Next slide. So just to, as we think about the way forward, and in particular, I'd ask you to think about three things. I know you're talking about mandatory due diligence legislation in Germany, and Germany being a lead country in Europe, to mention four things. So first, the need for all workers being entitled to legal and social protection. So I hope that if there's only one thing this presentation's left you with, is not to try and categorize and say, well, we are going to not authorize informal work or ban informal work or not authorize homework. They're in the supply chain and they're either going to be regulated or they're going to go unregulated. And so it's important not to make divisions between workers, but for all workers to be entitled to legal and social protection. I think Italy really leads the way. They have in their constitution that all workers are entitled to labour rights. In a recent court case confirming this. So secondly, that there needs to be transparency all the way down the chain. I know that Lucy Brill is going to talk about that, so I'm not going to talk about it any further. Thirdly, I want to just talk to you about worker-driven compliance and have 2 slides on that. And then finally, the issue of, sorry, my last point, the issue of looking at procurement practices within brands. Okay, next slide, please. So you'll see on your right is a picture of Ali Enterprises in Pakistan, which was burnt down a few weeks after it had been audited. And so I'm not going to read to you the critiques of CSR. You're all very familiar with that. Might not be familiar with, and it's about that through the Asia Floor Wage Alliance, as we've been engaging this fear that if they're found out to be saying the wrong thing, they will lose their jobs. So I think what this certainly leaves us with is when in the case of mandatory due diligence legislation, if we continue to rely on auditors, and particular private sector auditors, it's going to fail. So this is a very quick slide.
Marlese, looking at the time, I think it would be great if you could conclude. I think for this example, I would say we move over it and hope that we can look at it in the discussion. But with that, I would suggest that we move maybe to your final statement.
Sure. So this is just on the Fair Food Program in Florida, and I think they've got some good ideas around. Christine, why don't you just give my last slide and people can just read it as I make a very quick final thing. Sorry, I'd actually timed it and it had been 20 minutes. So could you go one slide up? Thanks. I'm hoping in question time we can talk a little bit about worker-centered. I think this is final state prices, lead time.
I actually have problems hearing you, Marlese. I'm very sorry. So I think the connection is a bit bad. I suggest that we move on and hope that we can get a chance to have you back. With that, I would like to thank Marlese for your input and hand over to Sabine Ferenschild.
Yes, thank you very much. I had some problems also with the audio. I hope that my presentation will not be interrupted by technical problems. But to hurry up. In my input, I would like to focus on another group of informal workers, the migrant workers. The group of migrant workers consists roughly of two parts: migrants who migrate internationally and migrants who migrate internally. Oh, okay. If you take both parts of migrant workers, international migrants and internal migrants, then you can see that they make up a large part of the global workforce. According to the ILO, international migrant workers number about 160 million people, while the number of internal migrant workers is significantly higher, around about 700 million people. For India alone, it is assumed that there are 40 million migrant workers, most of whom work informally. The proportion of women among international migrant workers depends greatly on the country in question, but also on the economic sector, as you can see later in my research survey on India. In many countries, women make up half or more of the migrant workers. In other countries, especially the Arab countries, they make up only 20 to perhaps 30% of the migrant workers. Next slide, please. According to the OECD risk analysis for the textile sector, there are 5 human rights risks that can be identified that particularly affect migrant workers. The OECD guidance doesn't clearly state whether it refers to international migrants or to internal migrants, but in most cases, for example, when it comes to seasonal migrants, the mentioned risks can affect international as well as internal migrants. With the exception of lack of legal status that might contribute to forced labor, all mentioned risks on the following 2 slides concern both groups of labor migrants. These 2 slides contain excerpts from the OECD guidance. In the left column, you find the human rights risks. In the middle column, the risks regarding migrant workers are explained. And then on the right side, it is explained where the risks exist within the textile chain. As you can see on the former slide, the risks are, no, not in the next slide, please go back. The 5 mentioned risks are child labor, gender-based violence that are linked to migrant labor, and then forced labor. That's now the next slide, please. Forced labor, excessive working hours, and non-compliance with wage regulations that often hit migrant workers within their work in global supply chains, but also in domestic value chains. You can see from the right column of the table that the risks basically can affect all processing stages of the textile chain, from cotton field to garment factories. The explanations in the OECD guidance, from which the table is only an excerpt, correspond with findings of Suedwind's own research. Please go ahead. Next slide, please.
Yeah.
Together with our Indian partner, Center for Labor Research and Action, we conducted a total of 3 surveys of employees in cotton fields and textile factories between 2014 and 2019. We interviewed workers in cotton production, in ginning, spinning mills, in weaving units, and also in garment production. All in all, we interviewed several hundred workers from cotton field to garment factory, and we asked them about their region of origin and their working conditions. I would like to very, very briefly present the results that are related to our topic today. Next slide, please. On this map on the left, you can see the state of Gujarat in India, marked in red. In Gujarat, we interviewed more than 100 workers working in 10 factories during our 2015 survey. You find the location and also the names of the factories in the map on the right side. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. The survey revealed that 60% of the interviewees were migrant workers. We concluded that among all workers in these factories, the proportion of migrant workers is correspondingly high, but we did not verify this. The migrant workers responding our questions came from other Indian states to make their living in Gujarat's textile industry. The most important regions of origin are shown on this map. And so they are part of the internal migrants. They are not international migrants. The migrant workers were relatively young. 65% were under the age of 13 years, and they were predominantly male. Only 30% were women. This male-dominated structure is very typical for the textile industry in Gujarat, in contrast to the southern Indian textile regions, for example, Tamil Nadu, or other textile producing countries such as, for example, Bangladesh. Next slide, please. In terms of employment relationships, the vast majority of interview partners had no employment contract. They were hired through oral agreements only, mostly through labor agents. And the majority worked only for a limited time. For example, they were hired as daily wage workers in the factories, especially in the factories like ginning and spinning facilities, where they work only for 2 months up to 8 months, or they worked seasonally in the cotton fields. And very important, a major factor, they had no access to Social Security. I would like to add an update related to COVID-19. Coming to the Corona crisis, you can imagine that migrant workers have been hit very hard. Firstly, by the government's lockdown in India, I think starting in April, millions of migrant workers lost their jobs due to the lockdown. As daily wage workers, they were particularly vulnerable with limited or no access to Social Security, and mostly living in poverty. Living hand to mouth, their loss of livelihoods during the lockdown has led to a lack of money to pay their rents or pay for food. Women were impacted, whether because of their gender, responsibilities as caregivers, or as members of disadvantaged castes and communities. A lot of women members of disadvantaged castes work on the cotton fields in Gujarat, and they were in a very difficult situation. An Indian NGO, the Stranded Workers Action Network, found that shortly after beginning of lockdown, 50% of workers had food rations left for less than 1 day only. 74% had less than half their daily wages remaining to survive for the rest of the lockdown period. And 89% had not been paid by their employers at all during the lockdown. This only to give a short update on the corona situation. And now this slide, this very brief insight into the risk analysis of the OECD, the results of our own research as Suedwind Institute together with our Indian partner, and also the short look on COVID-19 impact on migrant workers shows that it is very important in the context of each company's due diligence to analyze the occurrence and also the extent of migrant labor. Check whether your suppliers employ migrant workers and check whether the human rights risks described above occur there. If so, develop appropriate corrective action plans and ensure remediation together with your suppliers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabine Ferenschild, for this insight on internal migration. And with that, I would like to hand over to Lucy Brill from Home Workers Worldwide.
Hello, thank you for this opportunity to join you today. And as Marlese said before, I think it's a really important opportunity. It's great that the Textile Bundes is focusing on this important issue of informal workers and home workers. And just to make the point that addressing home working, you're actually addressing some of the most vulnerable workers in supply chains, certainly the ones that are receiving the lowest wages almost always. And I think there's also lots of links with migration too. Lots of home workers are the mothers of migrant workers in factories, so that they're from the same communities often. So I think there's a lot of overlap in the ways, in the conditions that people are facing. Okay, I'm here from an organisation called Home Workers Worldwide, which is a labour rights NGO based in the UK that focuses on addressing or working with brands and governments and home workers organisations to improve home workers' working conditions. We're currently working with other partners on a, well, could I have the next slide, please? On a 4-year programme called the Hidden Home Workers Programme. And that's working, it's working in India, Pakistan and Nepal in fashion and footwear supply chains. I mean, Home Workers Worldwide would want to work with home workers wherever they're found in the world. I mean, and I think it's not just in countries in the global south. I've had conversations recently with brands that know of home workers in their chains in Bulgaria, for example, and even in the UK. But this particular project is focusing on South Asia. And we're working in partnership with HomeNet South Asia, that's an important member of WIEGO's networks. They are leading the advocacy in country on the issue of home working and supporting home worker organising. And we're also, through them, we've got local community-based partners that are engaging with home workers in key production hubs. And overall, the project is coordinated by Tradecraft India. And I guess what I really wanted to say here is that this is a great opportunity really for brands, that we have actually got capacity through this project to link up with civil society partners. And that's an opportunity to actually make some progress in working on issues facing informal workers in key production hubs. Okay, next slide, please. I think as I went through this project, one of the key things we've been doing is producing a toolkit to help brands and suppliers in addressing home worker issues. And we've been interviewing practitioners, NGOs, and also brand partners that have been looking at tracing home workers within their supply chains. As we know, home workers are often not easy to find, and we're trying to understand why that is. What are the barriers to transparency? And really, this particular quote came from an NGO that's based in Hong Kong. A lot of work on home working issues, and really the message that's coming down from many of the buyers is that home working is not allowed. And basically, if that message comes down, not surprisingly, suppliers internalize that message and don't tell brands about home working if it is present in their supply chains. Okay, could I have the next slide, please? So in order to address this, on the left-hand side, we've got what we call the cycle of denial and concealment. If brands have either an explicit ban on home working or a weak policy that makes it clear that we don't really approve of home working, suppliers take that message on board, and then they conceal home working. They don't disclose that if they're using subcontractors that may also be using home workers. They make out that everything is kept within the factory. And as a result, the working conditions that the home workers are facing become more and more hidden, and less visibility, and oftentimes more intermediaries will be involved in the chain, and as a result, pay rates become lower, and it's even more difficult for home workers to take action and improve their conditions. So in order to break this cycle, what we would be really proposing is we're encouraging brands to adopt a clear policy on home working, to recognise that they may have home workers within their chain, and to say explicitly that they permit home workers within their chain. And that's not saying that you have got home workers, but it's saying that you allow home workers, that you recognise this is a legitimate way of working, and you encourage suppliers to disclose if home workers are present. And likewise, that also gives suppliers the permission to encourage their subcontractors to disclose home working to them. And it enables home working to be brought out into the open. That home worker policy is not just saying that home working is allowed, it's also including other clauses and conditions that commit to working with suppliers to improve conditions, to map conditions as they might be, and to identify any challenges and work together to improve those conditions. So that's for us, that's the first step in addressing and working within supply chains. This final slide really is a map that's I'm trying to summarize a lot of different information here, but this is really intended to show that we recognize that brands are very different places. So some of the brands that we've recently interviewed have been working on home worker issues for many years, whereas other brands are really just beginning that monitoring due diligence process. So this is really designed to show that you can start wherever you are. The first step is the policy, bringing the policy to the attention of the suppliers, and then if home working is disclosed, it's mapping that supply chain, it's unpacking what is going on in the supply chain, and then drawing up an action plan with different stakeholders to address any issues. And I think through this toolkit that we're producing, there are many relatively straightforward steps that can be taken in order to improve conditions. So for example, setting fair piece rates, by using time and motion studies to establish what piece rate is necessary in order to ensure that home workers are able to earn the minimum wage. Using a job card system to record home workers' earnings. It's a straightforward system that can document, that basically brings things out into the open. So whereas oftentimes home workers are paid completely informally in cash, there's no record of the work that they've done. There's no record of any payments made. By using a simple either a paper-based system, or I know some brands are exploring electronic systems to record the work that's done. It makes it possible, if there is a problem, it makes it possible to take action. Step 5 is we're also encouraging brands to look at ways to work together with other brands. I think that's particularly with smaller brands where there may not be sufficient leverage. And it also makes it much more practical for suppliers, because oftentimes part of an order may use home workers, and then another brand's orders may use home workers, and you need to be introducing these tools and techniques across production. So we are looking to encourage people to work together wherever possible. So I think that's a really very brief run through of overview of the project, and I would encourage people to get in touch, to go to our website or to get in touch to find out more. And I look forward to answering any questions in the discussion section. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucy, for your input. And I think your plea for more transparency and really the need to increase traceability really echoes also what we discussed today in our panel discussion. And I'm really excited to hand over to Scott. Now, Scott Welker from GoodWeave. In our preparation, he has brought up the term of deep due diligence, and I think that we are all very excited to hear and understand what is behind this term, and how companies can actually really dig deeply into their due diligence practice. So Scott, the floor is yours.
Well, first I'd like to start by thanking Tectile Bundes for this opportunity, and my fellow panelists for their important and informative presentations. GoodWeave's mission is to permanently stop child labor in global supply chains. Our organization was founded by Nobel laureate Kailash Satyarthi in 1994. And since that time, we've become the leading global institution for working to end child labor in global supply chains through a very holistic market-based approach. Our system harnesses the power of the market through its work with brands and producers. This is really intended to drive supply chain transparency within licensed supply chains, allowing us to focus on the hidden informal supply chain where child labor and other abuses are prevalent. This hidden supply chain is where the most marginalized and vulnerable workers toil, as every presentation up to this point has pointed out. Next slide, please. GoodWeave's close proximity to producer communities in the region enabled us to document the immediate impacts faced by workers in the COVID-19 pandemic. We collected data through survey in India and Nepal. A full report will be launched soon, but in the meantime, I have 4 highlights of our findings. First, workers have seen significant disruption in their income. Since the pandemic, 60% of respondents have either lost their job or seen their incomes decrease. 40% of the workers maintained their jobs, and incomes were mostly based in large manufacturing units still producing existing orders. That was as of mid-June. The pandemic exacerbated forced labor risks to workers. Nearly 1 in 4 of the respondents report owing debt to an employer or contractor.
Sorry.
No problem. I'll have a dog too. Many workers express concern about their ability to repay these debts. It's just getting harder. The combination of school closures and decreased income places children at increased risk of child labor. With 100% of respondents' children not attending school due to closures, there is potentially catastrophic child labor crisis brewing. Nearly 8 in 10 of these children were attending school before the pandemic, but some parents wonder if they'll be able to send their children back due to financial circumstances caused by the pandemic. And females experienced more severe impacts from the pandemic than males. 85% of female workers surveyed have lost their jobs or experienced a significant decrease in income since the pandemic began, as compared to 52% of male workers. Approximately 34% female workers report owing debt to an employer or contractor versus 20% of male workers. And the children of surveyed workers reveal that child labor has increased since the pandemic, with higher increases among girls. The data points to an increased risk of exploitation, especially in the informal sector. The next slide, please. So, what is unique about GoodWeave? Our system is comprised of 5 pillars that work together holistically to achieve deep supply chain due diligence that stops child, forced, and bonded labor in all tiers of the supply chain. First, as previously mentioned, we harness market power to gain unfettered access to production chains by partnering with retailers and importers. In partnership with brands, we are helping to create a market for goods made without child labor. In carpets and home textiles, we distinguish these products with our GoodWeave certification label. In apparel, we provide deep due diligence that reaches the bottom of the supply chains. We've seen how this relationship with businesses can permanently change behavior and practices, making no child labor a market requirement for the producers, along with design, price, and other features. We clean up supply chains by independently monitoring them against the GoodWeave standard, our own set of requirements for producers. Products such as home textile and apparel are frequently produced by large outsourced production networks comprised of an informal workforce. Our monitoring includes all tiers of production. We verify compliance against our requirements by mapping and regularly inspecting factories and work sites, all the way down to the cottage industry and individual homes. Our inspections are random, unannounced, and frequent. They serve as a powerful deterrent to bad labor practices that lead children to being employed and workers exploited. We've always worked collaboratively with suppliers and support their continuous improvement. When child labor cases are identified, GoodWeave remediates individual cases through removal, rehabilitation, and long-term support. We offer educational opportunities to former child workers and those at risk of entering the workforce. Our social, yes?
Sorry, Scott, for me, the frame froze, but yeah, you're back apparently.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay, but please continue. I just wanted to highlight that we have budgeted 3 more minutes, and please, yeah, please continue.
Okay, well, I only have 2 more slides. I don't know where you lost me, so I will just pick up. We work to improve working conditions for all workers by addressing a broad set of workers' rights concerns through the supply chain and offering skills training and other improvement programs. Let's go to the next slide. Next slide. There we are. Okay. So far, GoodWeave's engaged with over 180 brands in 19 countries across multiple product categories, including but not limited to some recognizable brands like Target, Monsoon, VF, Gap, Macy's, Otto, and others. We've inspected units at all levels of supply chains, over 14,000 audits and inspections just in 2019, rescued over 7,600 children from child labor, and supported 19,000 plus children, or provided them with child access, or educational access. The GoodWeave model has contributed to reducing the prevalence of child labor in the carpet industry. And now we've expanded into new sectors such as apparel and home textiles. Next slide. So here's how you can work with us. 1, product certification. The brand would become a licensee, and the suppliers undergo the mapping and inspections in order to become licensees as well. Once that process is concluded, a GoodWeave label, certification label, can be affixed to the home textile or carpet product being imported from a licensed supplier. Our program with apparel and fashion jewelry companies also involves deep due diligence in the supply chains without certification. We work with apparel companies producing in India and recently also in Bangladesh. Retailers that sell GoodWeave certified products but do not source directly can promote their affiliation through our industry partner program. These are all retailers. And finally, GoodWeave works with other organizations to build their capacity so that they acquire the knowledge and tools to apply GoodWeave methodologies in new countries and sectors. So as my colleagues will be hosting a workshop immediately after the session at 4:30, and they're going to be focusing on the supply chain due diligence methodology components. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Scott, for your input. And as mentioned, we also have GoodWeave in the program in the following session. So if you want to learn more about their approach and practice, please join. And with that, I would like to hand over to Maren Barthel. So in one of our earlier speakers mentioned that audits are not really fit for the purpose. I assume that you disagree, and I'd be interested in hearing what Elevate has on offer to address the risks of informal workers. Yeah, so the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. Actually, I'm not sure whether I would fully disagree that audits are not the tool that should be chosen, because what the other speakers mentioned about the informal, especially with regard to home workers being informal workers, but also lots of migrant workers, the transparency, the hidden home worker, I really like that project name. This is something that we can also find out, and that is reflected in data that we have available. What I would like to do today is introduce you to our EIQ, that is the Elevate Intelligence Platform, where we draw our data from. The EIQ receives data from 2 sources. One, it's data from civil society, so indices that are publicly available, be it World Bank, from World Bank, from the United Nations, TIP report, UNICEF, ILO, and so on. And then we have the Elevate proprietary data, which come from audits that we conduct worldwide in all sectors, especially and above all, also in the apparel sector. Excuse me. We conduct approximately 18,000 audits for social, environmental, and security per year. So every audit is captured with minimum 100 data points. For many audit protocols, it's up to 700 data points. So we have a wealth of data that this EIQ is drawing from. As an explanation, we have 5 risk categories. We scale on the scale from 0 to 10 in 2.5 steps. So everything that is close to 0 would be identified as extreme risk, and everything which is close to 10, so from close to 10 is low risk. So everything moves on this scale. And the second explanation is for the indices, we have put them, so to say, into 5 buckets. These are 5 issues, which are labor. In the labor category, we have forced labor, migrant worker indices, child labor indices, freedom of association, wages, work time related issues. They all fall under labor. We have health and safety as a second one, which then of course is all the safety, be it OHS or fire and so on safety. Third one is environment, and then ethics and management systems. So today we are going to talk about the labor related risks, and we have indices for migrant workers within the labor bucket or within the labor category, but there is no own home worker index yet. And I think that is also already a reflection of what has been said earlier. It's really too small and it would be too granular based on the data that we have available to have an own index for this right now. So coming to the slides here, what you see now is a pretty much high-level heat map of the apparel industry with regard to migrant worker risks. And I think what you can already see here, one more word with regard to the migrant worker index that we are using. It's looking at 3 aspects, and it has already been mentioned before that these are pretty important aspects. First is the number of foreign migrant workers at a site, and I want to emphasize again, because that has been made clear, there is a difference between foreign migrant workers and internal migrant workers. In this case, we are talking about foreign migrant workers. So this foreign migrant worker index has the number of foreign migrant workers at a site. It also checks the percentage of foreign migrant workers in the population, which gives already first hints, because if, for example, the percentage of foreign workers is much higher at a site than it is an average at in the population, especially in that respective areas, that would already mean that a closer look needs to be taken. And the third point is the number of source countries that the workers come from. We do have countries where we have only limited source countries, but there are other countries like Malaysia or Jordan that are really very, have a wide variety of source countries and labor. The workforce is coming from all over the world, basically. So when you look at this picture and looking with it through the lens of the foreign migrant worker index, I think you can already see that the picture that you would expect if you look at a overall risk country list is pretty much different. So usually you would think the Northern Hemisphere and the Western Hemisphere countries like the US, but also in Europe, are pretty much green, maybe yellow. And then we have all the major issues in the Southeast and the Southern Hemisphere. But looking through this migrant worker lens, the picture changes pretty dramatically. And you can see that some of those countries that really have strong regulatory frameworks, like the US, like France, like Germany, like Italy also, they are in a category that we would identify as high risk or even extreme risk. For Italy, if you then look into more detail, it definitely has to do with the refugee flows of the past years coming from Syria and other countries. Italy has a very big textile industry, It also has to do with the huge Chinese community in Italy. So there are various reasons that make these countries high risk or extreme risk countries. Also, and if you take a look at the right hand side graph, as I mentioned before, we always categorize on a scale from 0 to 10. And if we look at the country risk scores or region risk scores, we have both. Then we can observe that the percentage that there's a strong correlation between migrant worker and forced labor issues. So that very often the migrant workers are prone to, they're a vulnerable group, and they are prone to and exposed to severe risks of forced labor, starting with real forced labor, passport retention, and all these issues. And for example, in Malaysia, this is not on this list, but we had over the past 5 years, Malaysia was already extreme risk country, but it had a score of 1.29 in 2016. In 2020, it has a score of 0.65. So it's extreme, really extreme risk, and it has deteriorated approximately 50% over the past 5 years. So that is a very important correlation that we observe, and where the brands and those who audit definitely should take a closer lens on and have a deeper look into the supply chains. Next slide, please.
Now we are actually approaching the end of our session, so Maren, could you maybe...
I'll be very quick.
2 sentences on your work on home workers, and then I think we will maybe have, if we overdraw by 5 minutes, time for 2 questions that arose. But yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so with home workers, I think we have heard it before, the transparency is really an issue, and they are extremely prone to exposed to inferior working conditions. This has been elaborated before for different reasons. I think the chart that you see on the left-hand side, it would be much more informative if we had more insights on home workers, if more brands would allow us to look deeper into this and gauge the transparency. So I think this is data that is reliable from what we have now, but of course it's not very comprehensive because we don't do so many investigations on home workers on behalf of brands. And I think that is something we have a home worker tool, for example, that could be used. And on the right-hand side, I think Christine, the slides will be shared later on. So you can see what, among others, should be looked into it and what is checked during an assessment. And you won't find a contract on this list because this is such a normal thing. Of course, that is the conditions in economy. Nothing can happen without a contract and a proper formal employment for home workers. And then next slide, please. That is the last one, and it's very fast. You will see from focus areas in key apparel sourcing countries, and this is again reflecting what we have heard earlier before. This is not related to health and safety. This is only related to labor issues, but you can see wages and benefits, overtime, rest days, and also freedom of association and collective bargaining are main issues that are the home workers and the migrant workers are not being taken care of. And I don't go into the right-hand side. This is something that must be looked at closely. We do that, for example, with our foreign migrant worker tool. These are the ILO forced labor indicators, and these have to be adhered to definitely if you want to make sure that migrant workers have and enjoy the same conditions as all the other formally and well-employed workers in the factory. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Maren, for your input. And I know that we had an ambitious plan for this session, but we also wanted really to take the opportunity to map the field a bit. And I think what also the data of Elevate highlights that, for example, issues of foreign migrant workers do not only occur far away, but we saw that Italy, for example, is also a high-risk country. So I think it really highlights that, that there is a need to really look and do a fine risk analysis with regards to specific supply chains and countries of origin. So we actually in this presentation have also compiled a lot of work on extra material that you can look into. And with that, I would like to hand over to we do have two questions that we came in through the chat that are actually from Marlese, and I hope that we can still hear her. Otherwise, we will make sure that she responds in writing. But the question was, what are examples of work that is carried out in Tirupur by home workers? And then another question was, are there examples of unions of informal workers? And I think actually WIEGO as a network organization brings those together. So Marlese, do you want to briefly answer to that?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. So I'm sorry about the camera issue. So the types of work are two types of work. So the one would be embroidery or embellishments on t-shirts, for example. So screen printing and making little flowers and things to put onto t-shirts. And then the others are sort of finishing work. So it would be cutting threads, well, actually three. The second one would be cutting threads, putting threads through tracksuit pants, and sort of ironing, folding, packaging, doing the last pieces of the work. And then there's still others which do like cut, make, and trim. So they get delivered the pieces and they sew them together. And then in terms of trade unions, there are trade unions, and particularly in India. So in Tirupur, they're SAVE. They've just managed to register as a trade union. They've been there for a very long time. And they've got about 100 members of staff. I mean, it's huge. And are also concerned in not having any child labor. I'm thinking about Scott in the supply chain. I mean, in India, there's also SEVA, which is the Self-Employed Women's Association, which is a trade union. It's organized over 4 million workers, not all of them home workers. There are also other sectors. And then there are other countries like Bulgaria. There's a unity, which is a trade union of home workers. So in other countries, home workers are organized, but they're not always recognized as trade unions. And so that's a big issue, actually. So good question.
Okay, thank you very much, Marlese. Now, with looking at the time schedule, I think we have to let our participants go into the next sessions, but I would like to briefly summarize that we as the partnership as a multi-stakeholder platform also see it as our job to establish links between different actors in the supply chain. And today here we also had two examples with Scott Welker and Lucy Brill of NGOs that are really open for collaboration and that are there also to help businesses mitigate their risks. And also SAFE, as mentioned by Marlese, is an organization that we collaborate with in the partnership in terms of our initiative in Tamil Nadu. So if you want to or have an interest in working deeper in this issue, please approach us because we will also look into how we can approach the topic of informal work in the future in the partnership. And so with this, I would like to thank our speakers very much for your time, and I'm I'm yeah, a bit bummed that we didn't have much more time for a discussion. Yeah, have to ensure that we yeah, carry on the work on informal work so that we can come back together yeah, to discuss how we can drive progress here. And with that, I hope that we will see some of you in the further sessions that are still ahead and in the closing tonight. But thank you very much, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.